Alright, here we go. Good evening again. This is, I started reading this last week. It's a book about first Buddhist women by Susan Merkel. So Thursday evenings for the foreseeable future I'll be talking about koans out of the movement koan or poems from enlightened women. And these are old poems, they're from two primary sources, this being one which is a book written about and including poems from a text that's 2,500 years old out of the Pali tradition. And the other one is Daughters of Enlightenment, which is by Beata Grant, and she has written gathered together poems from Chinese women. I talked about this last week. I'm not going to go through the whole preface again, but just by way of brief introduction, the reason I find this really interesting, and a lot of people do, is there is just a paucity of female voices. There is just a paucity of female voice in the history of Buddhism. There were a lot of female teachers, female enlightened women, nowhere near as many that were trained in the tradition, if you will, formally as men, but there were a lot out there. But such as they weren't respected, they weren't listened to, and when they did talk and they did rise to prominence, their stories generally weren't written down and brought forward. And this is important because it's important for lots of reasons, but one reason is female voices and male voices teaching the Dharma teach it differently. There's different energy in those teachings. So tonight we are going to cover the story of Patacara, and then a couple of her disciples. She's one of the early nuns at the time of Buddha. And then I'll read some of the poems. We'll talk about her story and a couple of other stories here. Read a couple of poems, and then I'll stop talking. We'll have a conversation about anything that comes up, but in particular I want us as a group to go back, read a couple of those poems together, and then just talk specifically about the poems and how those poems land. Before we do that, I'm going to, just by way of introduction, dilate a little on personal experience. So we Red Clay, we had our precept ceremony. A bunch of people received the precepts last Sunday, and one of the exercises those people went through was to reflect on people in their lives who had affected their perspective of virtue, their perspective of living a virtuous life, of moral life, and basically teachers. So to reflect on that. One of the things I do in my practice every morning is to do some kind of dedication to merit or metta practice, and I do exactly that same thing myself. And as I go through it and I look at the people in my life, well, I've got family, I've got loved ones, but if I look at people who are in the roles of community leaders, teachers, spiritual guides, and I go down that list of names, for most of my life they are white men. That's just my life, but it's kind of striking to me that as I do that, all these figures, there's a maths teacher from high school, there's actually nobody really who pops out from university, but in my first career, my first job, there was one particular man, and then I came across 3 years later to the US, there's another man, and it's just, so it goes on. And until relatively recently, no women, no people of colour. Now there are, Lisa Ernst, many of you know, is the teacher who's been my teacher for a number of years, and then Clement El-Amin, who's the Imam Emeritus of the Atlanta Masjid. He's an African American man of great influence in my life. So there are a few people in later years, but it's just so dominantly white men, and it's so sad. Because I know as women, you probably have a lot more women in your life who are mentors, but you probably also have a fair density of men. So there's a voice that's missing. There's just a voice that's missing. How do we fix this? Well, one thing we can do is we can go back and we can look at all the old texts and bring more female voices in. We can change pronouns, and there's a lot of things we can do. But there's always going to be a missing piece there, because the stories were written from a perspective, with a particular voice, with a slant on the stories that were chosen and narrated. So there's always going to be something missing there. We could focus on listening to more female voices today, and that is important. But for me at least, teaching voices of influence in this kind of context, they need to have weathered time. They need to have passed through a couple of generations so we can get a different perspective on them. So I think a lot of it is really, we need to be really diligent about making sure we capture these stories and write them down, and that we set these stories up so that they can be carried forward, so that future generations don't struggle with the same way we have. Alright, so that's a little bit of editorial. So Patacara and her disciples. Patacara ended up being a remarkable teacher and leader within the Buddhist community of Buddha's time. We'll get to that piece, and I'll bring in some stories, some comments from some of her disciples. But her story is kind of an amazing story. So she grew up a banker's daughter. She grew up in a wealthy family, arranged marriage. She had fallen in love though with one of the, I think it was one of the staff. So she ran away and they got married. So then she got pregnant, and as the pregnancy was advancing, she wanted to go home to her family to give birth to the child. So her husband was reluctant for that to happen. So one night when he was sound asleep, she snuck out and started heading away home. He realized what had happened. He tracked her down, followed her. He found her, and in the middle of the woods she gave birth to their first child, and they went back home again. Happened again. So she traipses off into the woods to try and go home, same way. He, same time, figures it out, takes their other child, follows her, finds her. So same comes across. In the woods, the birth comes upon her unexpectedly, or it arises. So she gives birth to the second child out there, and that night she's cuddled up with her two kids, and her husband isn't there, and she doesn't know why her husband hasn't come back. He's gone wandering off. And in the morning, she finds that he's been bitten by a snake. So she's just grief-stricken. The storm comes on, terrible weather. She decides to keep on going home because she needs the consolation and solace of her family. So she keeps heading home in this terrible storm. Comes to a river that's in flood. She's exhausted. She's got two kids. She can't carry the two kids across. So she carries the infant across and leaves the infant on the far bank. Goes back to the first bank to get her first child. She keeps on glancing over her shoulder to make sure the infant's okay, the newborn. An eagle comes down and takes the newborn. So she screams. Of course the eagle doesn't pay any attention. But the first child thinks she's calling to him. So the first child comes running to her. Of course it goes into the river and it drowns. Desperate, that story. She carries on home to her parents, and she gets to the village, and there's clearly something big going on, and people are obstructing her. She says what she's there for. They say, no, you can't go. And she's insistent, and they say, well, there's this big storm last night. Well, your parents' house collapsed, and your father, the banker, your mother, and your brother, they were all crushed in the house. They're all dead. Desperate story. So of course she goes wandering off, bumps into the Buddha. Buddha says, what does he say? Sister, recover your presence of mind. So she recovers her presence of mind, says, help me. She realizes she's naked when she's recovered her presence of mind. They cover her with a robe, and she's crying. The Buddha says, in your many lives you have shed more tears for the dead than there is water in the four oceans. and she gradually comes to recognize the transience of life, accepts Buddha's teachings, becomes a disciple of the Buddha, which puts her in the nuns community led by Mahaprajapati, who was Buddha's mother-in-law. So that's her story. I'll read her Enlightenment poem later. She had, of course, a whole bunch of disciples, and to give some credibility to Patacara as a teacher, these are some of the quotes that come from those disciples. I met a nun who had her own food and drink. She was Patacara. She guided me in leaving home, encouraged me, and urged me to the highest goal. Here's another one. We have taken your advice. This is a whole bunch of 30 nuns. We have taken your advice and will live honouring you. And they bowed. I went to a nun I thought I could trust. She pulled out the arrow hidden in my heart. So this is a woman who clearly had a profound influence on a lot of people. There's another story here from a nun by the name of Kanda, which is another desperately sad story. I won't tell you the whole story, but it's another one where her family loses all their wealth. She's a child, her family loses everything. Then a sickness descends and all the family die. She's the only survivor. She's begging, and she bumps into Patacara, who gave her food and helped her. So I'll read the poems and then make a couple of comments as I go through them, and then I'll stop talking and we'll talk about your reflections and then review the poems together. So the first one, which is Patakara's Enlightenment poem, there is a tradition that as somebody is enlightened, they compose a poem. It's kind of in a celebration of their enlightenment. It's an expression of their enlightenment, and the language of these poems, there's some patterns, some standard tropes in there, but a lot of them are just very clear comments of just the direct experience of being enlightened. So here we go, Patakara's Enlightenment poem. When they plough their fields and sow seeds in the earth, when they care for their wives and children, young Brahmins find riches. But I've done everything right and followed the rule of my teacher. I'm not lazy or proud. Why haven't I found peace? This is the frustration of a diligent practitioner. Bathing my feet, I watched the bath water spill down the slope. I concentrated my mind the way you train a good horse. So there's a couple of metaphors in there. Bath water spilling down the slope. Water is used to describe the calming of the mind and the cooling of the mind as we settle into meditation. And the running away is obviously the running away of the sense of self, the identity. And the way you train a good horse, the really good horse runs just at the sight of the whip. You don't need to touch it with the whip, it just runs at the sight of the whip. Then I took a lamp and went into my cell, checked the bed and sat down on it. I took a needle and pushed the wick down, and when the lamp went out, my mind was free. I took a needle and I pushed the wick down. The needle is ekagata, single pointed concentration, single theme concentration. So I took a needle, I focused my mind, and I pushed the wick down. I put pressure on that which was sustaining the fire, the fuel that was sustaining the fire, and the feeding of the fuel on the fire. In Pali, it's the same word. It's upadana. Upadana means the fuel, and it also means the fire feeding on the fuel. When the lamp went out, my mind was freed. Nibbana is the cooling off, and it's actually the release of fire from the fuel. It's the cessation of that feeding. Our problem is we feed, we cling, we crave, We seek nutriment. That nutriment is food, it's ideas, it's habits, it's views. We feed on these things and we create this identity, this self out of these things. The release is when we let go of that feeding. And the metaphor of the fire, it's not that the fire has gone, it's not that the fire's gone out, as in totally being extinguished or has become extinct. Fire is an element, and at the time it was thought that the fire, it's released, the fire is free. It's just been freed from this process of clinging and burning on the fuel. When the lamp went out, my mind was freed. So the second poem, this is a poem that is in honor of 30 nuns under Patacara. So she was a woman of considerable influence and considerable prestige at the time. So this is Patacara saying, with pestles, Brahmins grind corn, feeding wives and children, Brahmins find riches. Pretty much the same as we just read. Practice the Buddha's teaching, you won't regret it. Quickly, when you have washed your feet, sit down beside me, intent of peace of mind, practicing the Buddha's teaching. So then the narrator says, when they heard Patakara's teaching, they washed their feet and sat down beside her, intent on peace of mind. They practiced the Buddha's teaching. In the first watch of the night, they remembered they had been born before. In the middle watch of the night, the eye of heaven became clear. In the last watch of night, their great dark was torn open. That's describing Buddha's awakening experience. In the first watch of the night, so in the sutra where he woke up, the story he tells when he woke up, in the first watch of the night, he saw all of his past lives. In the second watch of the night, he saw through karma. He understood all arising, abiding, cessation. Done. In the third watch of the night, he woke up. He ceased to be Siddhartha Gautama. Buddha arose. In the last watch of night, the great dark was torn apart. They stood up, then bowed to her feet. And the 30 nuns said, we have taken your advice and will live honouring you, like the 30 gods honouring Indra, who never lost a battle. We have the 3 knowledges, there are no obsessions in our minds. And then the last of these poems, which is by this the person who at the time was a child, Kanda, who had lost her family wealth and then her family. I was in a bad way, a widow, no children, no friends, no relations to give me food and clothes. I was a beggar with a bowl and stick and wandered house to house in the heat and cold for 7 years. Can you imagine being a young woman in India at this time, living like that? It would have been awful. It would have been unspeakable. But I met a nun who had food and drink, and went up to her and said, take me into the homeless life. She was Patacara. Out of pity she guided me in leaving home, encouraged me, and urged me to the highest goal. I took her advice. It wasn't wasted. I have the 3 knowledges. There are no obsessions in my mind. Actually, this is a poem I really like. There is a 4th poem I want to read to you. 4 or 5 times I left my cell. I had no peace of mind, no control over my mind. I went to a nun I thought I could trust. She taught me the Dharma, the elements of body and mind, the nature of perception, and earth, water, fire, and wind. I heard what she said and sat cross-legged 7 days full of joy. So this is a way of describing those deep meditation states which are often talked about in a scary word, the jhanas. Right? That's what that is. 7 days full of joy, because the teaching had been the teaching of the 4 elements, the body parts, which are core Buddhist teachings. When on the 8th I stretched my feet out. There's a koan where it's It's like reaching behind you to grab the pillar, says Avalokiteshvara. When on the 8th I stretched my feet out, the great dark was torn apart. So I find these poems rather lovely. They're simple, they're unornamented. There's no fuss, very direct. But you've heard enough from me, so let me stop talking and let's see what you all think of this. Oops, that's the wrong way to do it.